Good afternoon, ladies and gents, and welcome to our lesson today. And our lesson today is about colonial administration, especially indirect rule. And our case studies will be of Kenya and then northern Nigeria, where we'll majorly discuss indirect rule. Now, this part talks about Kenya in the introduction, yet this part majorly appears in paper 2. Why has Kenya been used to showcase this example or to explain this topic of colonial administration, especially indirect rule? This is because the structure of colonial rule is almost similar to Kenya and northern Nigeria. Why? Because both of them were colonized by Britain, and it is Britain which majorly used, indirect rule. So in chapter 1, we were all about the scramble and partition of Africa, and out of it, after the successful scramble and partitioning of Africa, there emerged various territories, Britain being one of the colonial powers that got some of the territories in both Western Africa and Eastern Africa, that is Kenya. They had to apply various structures of colonial administration to ensure that they maximized the most out of their colonial territories. Again, different colonial powers used different methods to administer their rules in their colonies. Now, the British used both indirect rule in Kenya, and I'm specific about northern Nigeria, and then in places like Zimbabwe, the British used direct rule. Now, there are parts of Kenya where British used direct rule, especially where the already established system of traditional or the existing native rulers, like the chiefs or the kings. For instance, the Wanga, as I'm going to teach later. Now, what is indirect rule? Now, this is the system of administration in which colonial powers use existing traditional structures of government to implement colonial policies. In the western part of Kenya, the Wanga sub-tribe used to be ruled by Nabongo Mumia or the chiefs. So when the colonial powers came and they found the existing good structure of governance, they just employed the chief to do the work. It was like using the chiefs to become the proxies. But in areas where they never found these existing chiefs, more so in most parts of the Cushitic, Kenya, Nilotic and Bantu parts of Kenya, then they had to use direct rule. Now, the application of direct rule was very, very important. Why? It was always observed that or seen as a maximum utilization of the local traditional system under the supervision of the white colonial administrators. So various factors made the British to use this indirect rule, as we are going to check. Again, as long as the traditional rulers were going to serve the interest of the colonial white settlers to exercise power and authority over their subject, the British were very, very comfortable with it. This is why this part is a very, very important part of paper 2. So Kenya will just introduce you, it will just be a benchmark for us to track how indirect rule was applied in Nigeria. Now, the reasons why the British used indirect rule in Kenya. Now, these factors, I'll explain them one by one. Number 1, lack of adequate funds to use in administration. Now, what happened? When the IBEAC or the company rule was introduced in the colonial government, this company did not have adequate funds to pay everybody. In the structure of government today, starting with the president to the lowest executive, who is the head of Nyumba Kumi, all of them are always almost in the government payroll. Now, when the company rule came, or the British came in Africa, they saw that they could not put or subject a lot of people in the payroll. So instead, they wanted to use the local leaders to help them to administer effectively. Again, inadequate personnel. The British, they also had colonies elsewhere in Africa. So for instance, in other countries like Zimbabwe, Egypt, Sudan, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, that is Zambia and Zimbabwe consecutively, Botswana, and all those other parts. And in fact, they also had colonies outside even the African territory like India. So this meant that they had employed their personnel elsewhere in also other territories. So it meant that they lacked adequate personnel to just enable them to administer their direct rule in Kenya. Then avoidance of resistance. Now, wherever the British applied indirect rule and when they embraced the local leadership, it meant that the people were going to psychologically accept them, since they were using the local chiefs to be their proxies of their rules. Then again, the method had initially been successful in parts of India and Uganda. Now, initially, before the British ventured into Kenya, the first parts of their colonies included India, which was a very, very large country. Today, it is referred to as the Indian subcontinent, yet it is a very, very vast domain or a vast country. Then again in Africa, in Uganda, where the Kabakas ruled the Baganda kingdom, it was very, very easy for the British to rule, and it was so successful. So when they had used indirect rule under Kabaka of Uganda, then it proved to be very successful. So they also wanted to apply it in Kenya. Then some parts of Kenya had existing traditional systems of government. So you remember I've told you about the Wanga, who had their chiefs, and again the Maasais, who had their Oloibon. So in such territories or domains, it was going to be very easy for the British to use direct rule. Now the structure of governance or the structure of the British rule in colonial Kenya was this way. The central government of the British was represented by the governor. First of all, it started with the colonial secretary, and the colonial secretary was based in London. So this was like the cabinet secretary who was in charge of colonizing people. So he was based in London. Now in the country was the governor, then the provincial commissioner who ruled the provinces. So the governor was in charge of the state or the colony. Then provincial commissioner was in charge of the provinces. Then under the provincial commissioner were the district officers. Then under the district officers who are in charge of the districts were the chiefs who are in charge of the location. And under the chiefs were the headmen. Now here I have stroked northern Nigeria because this is a blueprint of what is going to help us to study in the structure of British colonial rule in northern Nigeria. So when it comes to Nigeria, I'll also add some aspects that you'll need to know. So that is that. Now in Kenya, when the British came, the Wanga, the Arabs, and the Maasais, who had already existing structures of leadership, provided a very, very soft landing spot for the British to rule. So in these areas, their local leaders were automatically elevated to become chiefs, not district officers. Now from the district officers, provincial commissioner, governor, up to colonial secretary upwards were all white men and not the local. Others, including the Bantu groups, the Highlands and Plain Nilotes, the River Lake Nilotes, and all others basically were not ruled centrally by a centrally recognized authority. So under such areas, the British could use indirect rule. So consequently, it enabled the British to take control of Kenya, and this entry of British colonialism was strengthened when they employed the company rule that I taught in the previous lesson. Then application of British rule in Kenya. Now, in various communities, they applied both indirect and direct rule. For example, the Agikuyu communities, there were places that had existing chief. In such areas, they applied indirect rule. But in the places where places of Agikuyu communities where there were no existing leaders, especially in places like Murang'a and Nyeri, here the British had to use direct rule. Now, in places where, like the White Islands, where the British had occupied, the British could apply indirect rule. Again, why? Because here they had to use the leaders, existing leaders, to help them to administer the colonial territory, to help them to get the workers, and to help them to get the forced labor that they needed in the White Islands. In Western Kenya, the British found that the Wanga already had an established system of leadership. So he was made a paramount chief, not only over the Wanga, but the entire Luya sub-tribes. In areas like the Luo and Abagusi land or Gusi land, where the British found no existing traditional leaders, they had to employ direct rule. And what did they do? They used collaborators to help them to administer the colony. Now, there are impacts of the British indirect rule in Kenya. But before that, we have to note the role of these traditional leaders, stroke chiefs, stroke headmen. This was their role. Their role was very minimized. Number 1, to maintain law and order. Number 2, to settle petty disputes like marriage disputes. Number 3, to clear roads and footpaths. Number 4, to collect taxes. Number 5, to ensure that they had recruited labor that was very much needed for the public works of the vast domain that the British control. Then to control cultivation of illegal plants such as bang. Then again, to restrict carrying of weapons. Then to control the brewing of illegal liquor. So one would wonder, how did the British know that this thing is illegal, yet some of these liquor were they had traditional impact. So that is how it was. Now let me teach you again the effects of the indirect rule in Kenya. Number 1, it divided the African communities along tribal lines. To date, if you go to the countries which were majorly controlled or colonized by the British, then there exists a deep mistrust of various ethnic groups. Why? Because the British used something that is called divide and rule. So various tribal leaders were made to be the leaders of their various tribes. But then it pitted them against their neighboring communities. So to date, the existing tribal hatred or tribal strife that we experience in Kenya, because we were majorly a former British colony, can be traced back to the effects of the indirect rule in Kenya. Then number 2, the appointed chiefs supported colonial administration. Now, when the local chiefs or the appointed chiefs supported local tradition, when they supported the colonial administration, it meant that some of them were treated as traitors. So you'll find that in the later uprisings that during the nationalism of Kenyan communities, they were seen as traitors because they were like in bed with the colonial government. Then again, it boosted the British policy of divide and rule through the creation of tribal reserves. Now, all the tribal reserves that were created after land had been alienated, those reserves, people used to stay in those reserves according to their ethnic lines. Again, the Kipande system that the British had introduced to ensure that the Africans stayed in the reserves indicated the tag name or the tag of their tribal lines. So this boosted, again, tribalism. Again, Africans were ruled using unpopular colonial rules implemented by the colonial chiefs. Now, all these rules that were implemented upon by the chiefs, the rules were derived or they were structured by the colonial government. But these rules were very unpopular. Number 1, something like forced labor. Africans already, they had an existing economy of growing subsistence crops that could just sustain them, their livelihood. And they had enough. Now when forced labor and forced taxation came with the chiefs, these rules became unpopular. That is why the chiefs were treated with the strife they deserved. Then again, the chiefs were regarded as collaborators since they became unpopular among native Africans. The chiefs now became the enemy of their own Africans because they were seen as to be collaborators with the British. Then again, the colonial chief misused their positions to amass wealth. Now that is going to be very, very normal because the British government had entrusted them with the autonomy that they wanted. It meant that they used this opportunity to even exploit Africans further, to be corrupt again, then to amass wealth. To date, most families who trace their lines to former colonial chiefs are some of the big names in majorly in their regions or even our country. Now, after looking at the structure of the British colonial rule in Kenya, that was going to be a blueprint, I want to take you to northern Nigeria. So when the British arrived in Nigeria, they divided Nigeria into three major parts. Number one, Lagos, which was the administrative region. Number two, northern Nigeria, which was vast and majorly a Muslim-dominated zone. Number three, southern Nigeria, which had a lot of native tribes that were the majority. And these three regions, the British applied different rule. So for the northern Nigeria at large, they applied what is called indirect rule. That is the subject of our topic today. And then for the southern Nigeria and Lagos, because of various challenges that we will see later in this lesson, they applied what is called direct rule. And there were various reasons because of that. Again, the administration of the indirect rule method of administration can be credited to a British agent of colonialism that was called Frederick Lugard. Yes, according to Frederick Lugard, indirect rule implied what is called a single government in which the native chiefs have clearly defined duties and an acknowledged status equal with the British officials. So the chiefs, the African chiefs that they found in northern Nigeria, they were treated with equality just the way the whites were treated. Then this meant that the chiefs in the northern Nigeria, where they applied indirect rule, were given a lot of power to enable them to administer. The British could only interfere with the northern Nigerian chiefs wherever it was necessary, such as very, very few instances where they were thought to receive resistance. Again, it was a task of the British officials to conserve what was good for the indigenous institution to assist them to develop their own lands. So already when they saw that the institution of the chiefs in northern Nigeria was good, all they had to do was to conserve them. Now, let me go to the reasons why the British used indirect rule in northern Nigeria. Number one, the northern Nigeria had an elaborate existing chiefly administration system. I can say that before the coming of the British, the northern Nigeria was already involved in transatlantic and trans-Saharan trade. So this, alongside Islam that existed in northern Nigeria, enabled them to have an elaborate structure of rulers who were respected, not only respected traditionally, but they were also accorded the respect that they deserve because of Islam. Islam had initially united the northern Nigeria so that they operated as a unit. Again, if you look at northern Nigeria to date, it is a home to very few tribes that cover a vast domain of land, unlike southern Nigeria. Meaning, Islam had united these people first. Number two, this led them to establish what is called a structured system of administration that existed even before the pre-colonial time. So this meant that it was going to be very, very easy for the British to apply indirect rule in that country. Number two, the British wanted to avoid what is called resistance from the colonized people. I told you, as the British were going to embrace the colonial chief or the existing traditional chief of the northern Nigerians, then the British were only going to use them as proxies to act on their behalf. So already these existing traditional chiefs, they were psychologically accepted by the people. So there were people who accorded the respect they deserve. It meant that whatever they said was not going to spark an outrage or resistance of any form. Then the third one, the British had recorded a prior success of the method in India. Yes, India is a vast domain, and I have to repeat, it was a vast colony. In fact, it is called a subcontinent. Now, indirect rule had really succeeded in India. Why? The existing structural leaders of the Brahmin caste in India, they were the ones who the British accorded the duty of recruiting for them labor, working for them and doing everything. And it had really worked because these people, it was very easy for the local to embrace them more than they could embrace the British foreigners. Now in northern Nigeria, it was the same. So they were going to use their own chiefs. Then lack of finance to pay for the administration. I've told you before that Britain not only colonized northern Nigeria and Kenya, it colonized a lot of countries. It meant that the colonial secretary had the obligation of employing governors, first of all, in all of these states, meaning those were people with under payroll. Then provincial commissioners under all these states. Then again, district officers up to the district officer levels. So it is the chiefs that they used to employ natives. So with this, they were cutting their payroll or they were slashing their budget to ensure that they maximized their gains from the colonial territories. Again, there was a shortage of European administrative officers, There was a shortage of European administrative officers to be used to administer the northern Nigeria. Now, administrative officers are people or personnel who are qualified to have administrative authority or to undertake authoritative mandate. For instance, those are people who have done public administration, and the British, being an elite society, they wanted personnel who are qualified. So it is this personnel, maybe that were very, very less, and this meant that they had a shortage of European administrators. So employing the locals and just giving them a little education to make them elite to the level of what they were required to do was very easy than going back to Britain and recruiting people up to the level of chief and headmen. Then again, communication barrier between the British and locals. Today, there is a say that says English was born in Britain, it grew up in America, it died in Nigeria, and it was buried in India. So to date, even if you hear the Nigerians and the accent or slang of English, it is a different one that is very, very different from the British accent. So it means that there was a language barrier. You can't blame it on the Nigerians, but this is a foreign language that was imposed on them. Now, with this, it meant that it was not easy for the locals to grasp English very fast. So because of this lack of communication barriers, the British only did this. They educated the chief in English, and it is the chief who used to communicate directly with the people and tell them what the administration want. So it was just to ease the colonial rule. Then again, the last one was poor transport that made it difficult for the British to reach all parts of the territory. Now, northern Nigeria is a vast domain, or it's a vast country, part of the country that had or lacked the proper transport system like railways and proper roads. So for the British rule or the British authority to reach up to the various ends or the farthest end of northern Nigeria, they needed local rulers who could penetrate whatever they want into the various parts of Nigeria. Now, I want us to look at the various I've talked about the reasons for the indirect rule. Now, let me now explain it very deeply. Now, northern Nigeria was what is called a caliphate. And this caliphate was ruled, was part of the Sokoto Caliphate. Now, this caliphate was divided into various parts called Emirates. Now, these Emirates were semi-autonomous, meaning they were semi-independent. They could create their own rule, and they were ruled by the emirs. And the emirs they had to report to the caliph of Sokoto. Yes? So meaning there was already a structure. If you look at caliphates and emirs, it shows you already that it confirms what I earlier said, that northern Nigeria was united under Muslim religion. Now, this is how the British applied this rule in northern Nigeria. So after occupying Nigeria, the British left the emirs, or the chiefs, to administer their rules in northern Nigeria, but under the supervision of the British residents. Now, these British residents, they were attached to every emir in northern Nigeria. Now, these British residents, again, they their work was to safeguard the emirs and check if they were abusing power or not. Now, under these emirs, again, slavery, which was very, very discouraged, or which was a reason why the British scrambled and partitioned Africa, participated in that scramble, was ended. So the emirs had already been conducting slavery before, and when the British came, they had to appoint the official to check the emirs to ensure that they were not going to continue with slavery. Again, under the application of indirect rule, there were changes that were made to the old system that the emirs or the caliphates used to have in Nigeria. Number one, the Fulani, who are predominantly the major tribe in the northern part of Nigeria, their system of taxation, which was complicated, was replaced by a single tax that was used to be levied on each village. Again, the taxes, however, continued to be collected by emirs, and the officers were paid into the emirs from the emirs' treasuries. So it means that the British were not even paying them. The emirs could collect the tax by themselves and even pay themselves. So this justifies why indirect rule was very, very efficient in northern Nigeria. Again, a fixed proportion of the emir's revenue was transferred to the central British administration. So the emirs could collect taxes, have them centrally located, then they apportion themselves and allocate themselves salary. Then a small portion of it they could take and give it to the British administration. Now this was used to finance specialized services, including health in the region, agricultural sector, the railway building, and then these sectors that I've said, health, agriculture, and railway, the best people who could do this was the British experts. Then the rest of the revenue was left at the disposal of the emirs and British governors. Yes. Then the next one, the British also believed that if the African authorities could succeed if they acquired the responsibility of collection and the use of large sums of money. So the local authorities, they were expected to pay regular salaries to their worker. Again, they were also tasked with preparing proper budgets and presenting their accounts for auditing. But all these were subject to account by the British, who could do the checks and balances. Now these are the duties of the emirs. The emirs are the chiefs that I told you. Their duties were just the way the Kenyan chiefs were. You remember the roles of the chief in Kenya? It is not far from what the emirs used to do. So number one, they were used to collect taxes. Number two, they recruited labor for public work, such as building roads and cleaning paths, building of gabions and everything. Then again, they headed local governments, the existing government within the northern Nigeria localities. Then again, they tried cases in their local customary courts. This is very, very important. I have to explain it. I've said northern Nigeria was a Muslim-dominated area, so things like marriage. So they were to use courts such as Qadhi's courts to determine that. And it is that the locals who could do that, and not the British, who were predominantly Christians. Again, they appointed the heads of villages. Then again, they communicated colonial policies to the people. And lastly, they supervised the construction of roads and markets. So I want to go back again to the structure of colonial rule. This time, not Kenya. So I'll rub Kenya here, and I'll remain with northern Nigeria. Northern Nigeria. Northern Nigeria. So this is the alternative. Northern Nigeria. And here, I will add also a bit here. I will add a portion under the chiefs, and I will include emirs. Yes, the emirs were the local chiefs in northern Nigeria. So the colonial structure, the structure of the British rule colonial rule in northern Nigeria, you can just liken it to Kenya, though a few changes which are not notable. I'll explain them here. Now, the colonial secretary was based in London. Under him was the governor, who was based in Nigeria. Then the governor who was in charge of Nigeria, both Lagos, southern Nigeria, and northern Nigeria, used to be. Under him was the provincial commissioners, then the district officers, then chiefs or the emirs in this case. Then under them were the emirs were the local African headmen who are appointed by the emirs. Now, at the top, again, I've explained that. Now, at the top was the colonial secretary who was in London. Then under him was the governor who is in charge of the daily administration of the colony. Then next, the provinces who are under the provincial commissioner. Then again, district headed by the district officer. Then under the district officers were the local emirs. Yeah. Then under the emirs who were in the location were the village headmen. Now, each of these provinces had a court of appeal in Nigeria, and this was this court of appeal was presided over by a resident magistrate. Now, this system of administration enabled the British to have a very good and efficient and effective control over the northern parts of Nigeria. Now, let us talk about the southern Nigeria. So, in southern Nigeria, it was very different from northern Nigeria. Already northern Nigeria was united under the emirs and Islam, caliphate, and everything. Again, they had an elaborate system of administration that they had psychologically accepted. Now, for the southern Nigeria, it was different. So, the administrative units that were based in Lagos and southern Nigeria, it was difficult for Frederick Lugard, to apply what he had applied in northern Nigeria. So he chose to use what is called direct rule. Now, various factors that I'm going to mention are the reason why the British chose to use direct rule in southern Nigeria and Lagos. These are the factors and I'll explain each one of them to you. Number one, the lack of a centralized governance system in southern Nigeria. Yes. Unlike northern Nigeria, the various tribes that stayed in the south, they never had a centralized governance system. Most of them were living their daily lives in a traditional and the most primitive way possible, that they were just at peace with how they lived. So they never had chiefs, they never had a system of administration. Then again, numerous cultural differences that were there in southern Nigeria. Now, unlike northern Nigeria, which was predominantly like 4 or 3 tribes, yes? In southern Nigeria, there were various cultural differences. The Igbo alone is a sub-tribe, but the Igbo alone had over 9 cultures, subcultures that were under them. It meant that most of these communities, they really had cultural differences. Now, introduction of new ideas like forced labor and forced taxation, which were unpopular with the people. The people of southern Nigeria, they were indigenous to their African system or economic, social, and political system of lifestyle. Now, when the British came about with the forced ideas like forced labor, it meant that, and taxation, it was just going to be imposed on them, meaning they really resisted fiercely against the British rule. This is what brings us to the next point: opposition of the elite Africans that were left out from the administration post. Nigeria is a land of elites, including the one noble or the first African novelist, Chinua Achebe. So the people who really embraced learning or education very fast. Now, when the Africans had been educated, those who became elite were left out from administrative posts. Why? Because they could reason against the British policies. Now, the British chose to use illiterate chiefs, and this meant that the leaders or the African elites, the Africans who had embraced Pan-Africanism and they wanted independence or autonomy, they really opposed the chiefs. Again, the British also left them out of administration, with a purpose. Why? They never wanted anybody who could rival or question their policies. Then again, the elites resented being ruled by uneducated chiefs. It is self-explanatory, as I have explained in the previous point. Then communication barrier between southern Nigeria and the natives, the southern Nigerian natives and the British. Again, Nigeria is home to many cultures, especially the southern Nigeria part, where there are a lot of tribes and a lot of people staying. Now, these various people, they're native to their own culture. They're also unique with their own languages. Now, this also brought about communication barrier, and they could never be at the British. The British had to come and apply direct rule to enable them to rule accordingly. Then again, use of excessive force by the British to suppress resistance and uprisings. Yes, so whenever each uprising arose, then the British always used a very excessive force. And this meant that they continued to receive what is called resentment from the Africans. Then failure of the British to fully understand the social, political, and economical customs of southern Nigeria. It was going to be an impossible task, or an almost impossible task, to understand the various cultures, yes, of various tribes that dominate the southern Nigeria. So with this, it meant that there was resentment. So the British had to be there physically to ensure they rule. Then misuse of power by appointed African chiefs. The African chiefs who were appointed, they used to even harass women sexually. Again, they used to harass people, even people who traditionally were treated with regards. The African chiefs used to disdain them. Now, with this, it meant that the Africans resented their elders and their mothers and sisters being mistreated by these African chiefs. Then the last thing is that the people had resented the direct taxation and forced labor. Now this is obvious because the southern Nigerians, they had their own indigenous way of living, whereby they survived on subsistence, farming, and small amount of trade that could enable their communities to survive. When the British came, they introduced forced labor and forced taxation, and this meant that the southern Nigerians communities were not just going to sit and argue with them or reason with them without resenting. So these are the very, very things that ensured that the British used, say, direct rule in southern Nigeria. Now, people also resented direct taxation and forced labor. I'll explain this point lastly this way. The colonial practices had resulted in riots in 1918, and by 1929, there were riots by women of Oloko who were opposing the way they were being taxed like men. Now, very fast, I'll go to the shortcomings of indirect rule in Nigeria. Shortcomings. What are the shortcomings of indirect rule in Nigeria? So there were challenges that these people had. Number one, indirect rule in Nigeria, it employed a system which had been devised to suit regions which had already been established. Well, okay. The system had been devised to suit regions which had already well-established indigenous administrative structures. So in regions where such structures that were not, did not exist, such as the southern part of Nigeria, it meant that it could not be easy to use indirect rule. Particularly among the Igbo, it really needed a great deal of adaptation. Why? The Igbo as a tribe also has subcultures or tribes inside it, meaning they could not have a very, very elaborate structure of leadership. So when the British tried to apply indirect rule there, it failed utterly. Now that is in southern Nigeria. Then the next thing was the language barrier. And this I'll explain this way. So very few European population or European administrators or British administrators took their time to learn the African culture. They were not conversant with the African culture, especially the African languages. Again, even if they were conversant with one language or culture, they were not going to take time to be conversant with various culture. Now, this failure of them not being multilingual meant that it was very, very difficult for them to be able to communicate with the local chiefs that were there in most parts of the Nigeria. Again, the chiefs and council used to take more interest in matters they understood than those that they were unfamiliar with. So things like forced labor, the chiefs were already familiar with it because slavery used to exist in Africa, even among African tribes in Nigeria. But on matters that they never understood, such as Christianity, it was very, very difficult for them to apply rules. So with the time, it became very, very difficult for them to apply the indirect rule that their colonial bosses wanted them to apply in Kenya. Then again, Frederick Lugard had brought about the idea of educating the chiefs or the local chiefs. Again, he wanted the chiefs and the councillors to be educated in ideas like being patient and applying skillful efforts. Now, this in leadership, all these things that the Lugard wanted them to be to learn or to be educated about needed them to take, number one, long time to learn, number two, a lot of skills, number three, a lot of effort and sacrifices. And the African, being Africans by then, it was very difficult for them to be very flexible and adapt to whatever the colonial government wanted to be. Then this Lugard idea of education, especially among the African chiefs, failed. Why? The local chiefs lacked patience. Some of them also lacked the skills. So therefore, most of them gave up easily on indirect rule. Then again, northern Nigeria was isolated from much of the southern Nigeria. Because they used to operate under the caliphate and the Muslim route, it meant that they lived in isolation from their southern counterparts. Now, because of this, there's a negative impact to this. So most of the northern Nigerian part remained undeveloped because of, again, the strict Islam laws that are so predominant in northern Nigeria. To date, northern Nigeria is a bit lagged behind as compared to the south on matters development. Then again, the chiefs whose rule never confronted with the English monarch continue being replaced. Now, the chiefs were replaced as they, number one, they were not conformed with the English monarch system of administration. Again, they were also unpopular among their fellow Africans. So fellow Africans considered them puppets. The monarch and the British considered them to be unpopular. So they were replaced regularly. Now this meant that indirect rule became very, very difficult and it failed. That was, no, it never failed, but that was a shortcoming or a disadvantage. Then again, there were some aspects of the system that were resented, such as taxation. Now, indirect rule was very, very key with taxation. That is why they used the African leaders to become their proxies or to become in charge of their taxes. Now, under this, again, I have to say that ideas like taxation were not going to be taken easily by the Africans. So this meant that the British failed. They faced a lot of shortcomings as with regards to taxation. Then the last one there is that the educated the elite used to resent the British rule. So they really resented the uneducated chiefs. Of course, they were feeling they were entitled. Now with time, it led to a shortcoming of indirect rule. Because with the time, it is these educated elites that went to the cities and villages and started popularizing nationalism that saw the British give in to the independence of Nigeria. These are the impacts of the indirect rule in Nigeria. I'll have to explain them. Number one, the traditional rulers became unpopular due to the unpopular policies like taxations. So as they collected taxes, the Africans really used to resent them and this made them to become unpopular. Number two, the African culture was well preserved. Now, indirect rule preserved the African culture. Why? For instance, in northern Nigeria, where the caliphate was given its autonomy, under him, the emirs or the local chiefs and the village headmen used to thrive. And this meant that these people, they were it preserved the African culture. So to date, in various parts of northern Nigeria, still the chiefs, the local chiefs, have been maintained and the autonomy still maintained. Now, most of them, it is even hereditary. Most of the chiefs, they leave it to their children after they've died. So it is even inherited. So this is an aspect of African culture that the British maintained to preserve thanks to indirect rule that they applied. Then again, the African chiefs emerged wealthier. So because these African chiefs, they had been charged with taxation, it was very culture or manner, it was just a moral obligation of them that at least they could get some of the wealth by themselves. I told you earlier that the emirs could even structure how they could pay the headmen. Again, they were only to remit some few funds or a portion of the tax to the British administration units. It meant that most of the wealth remained with them and they amassed or accumulated various amount of wealth. To date, it is very popular, a common slang in Nigeria that if one person becomes so entitled or becomes a wealthy elite, then they are referred to as chief. Now, this connotation is a connotation that we can trace it to the chiefs who are very wealthy during the indirect rule time of northern Nigeria. Then again, the loss of independence of the people of northern Nigeria. This was going to be very automatic. As the colonialists enabled them to rule themselves through indirect rule, they were not fully independent because they used to operate under the laws, under the taxes, under the levies, and under the administration of British. Remember, at the top was the colonial secretary, governor, provincial commissioner, district officers, who are all whites. So it was only the chiefs and emirs who used to control them, meaning they had lost their independence at the end of it all. Again, the abolishment of the Fulani system of taxation that I had earlier explained, then it led to the abolition of slavery and slave trade. During the struggle and partition of Africa, one resolution that was arrived at by the Western nations who participated in the Berlin Conference was, number one, they were going to fight against slavery. Now, slave trade was a part of the northern Muslim culture, and northern Nigerian Muslim culture was they practiced slavery in a structural manner. Now, when the British occupied that territory, one of their mandates, according to the Berlin Conference, was to stop slavery. Now, when they came and instituted their rule in northern Nigeria, whether or not they applied the indirect rule, it meant that their first mandate was to stop slavery. So one consequence or one impact of the indirect rule in northern Nigeria is that it led to the abolition of slavery as an institution and slave trade. Then the next thing is retention of Sharia law by the northern Nigeria made the region to lag behind. Now, the Sharia laws are I am trying to become a very religious sensitive person, but Sharia laws have some repressive values that they promote. For instance, the women are not treated with the same accord as men. So men are treated with some good, this is how it favors men. Now, because of Sharia law being in northern Nigeria and predominantly northern Nigeria, you'll find that mostly the women in the northern part are not as empowered as the women who are in southern and Lagos part of Nigeria. So because Sharia law was allowed to be continuous and the emirs were encouraged to continue with their rules, it meant that northern Nigeria lagged behind in terms of development, because of Sharia law. So to date, the southern Nigeria elites are the majority as compared to the northern Nigeria. But being an elite does not mean you are educated, but it also means you are rich. But as part of the wealth, as part as wealth is concerned, mostly northern Nigeria are wealthier. I think it comes also from trade. So history should not be biased to northern Nigeria that by saying it only lagged behind. The things that it has also promoted. Then the last one is it created a division between the educated and traditional African chiefs. Now, with the time, the British used to prefer educated chiefs to the uneducated chiefs. Now, to the uneducated chiefs, they were replaced with the people who could understand the structure of administration that the British wanted. Now, it was only a matter of time that those chiefs who were not flexible to being educated, they had to be replaced by the people who had become educated, and this meant that they lost their position to the educated chiefs. Again, the traditional chiefs were also not were also replaced by these educated chiefs. Now today I've mentioned the topic that I've taught is mainly set in paper 2 of even KCSE, because it is majorly outside history that touches outside of Kenya. But again, it can be set in a tricky way. For instance, you can be told, as I conclude, to discuss the similarities of indirect rule in Nigeria and Kenya. Now the similarities are as follows. Number one, the structure of British colonial rule in northern Nigeria and Kenya were all similar, because it was headed by the colonial secretary who was based in London. Under him was the governor in charge of the state, then the provincial commissioner in charge of the provinces, the district officers in charge of the districts, the chiefs or local men, emirs, who also had the headmen under them. Now, one similarity is that the chiefs and emirs and the headmen were Africans. Now, from district officers up to the colonial secretary at the top were Europeans. So that is the first similarity. Number two, we can say that the British used indirect rule both in Kenya and northern Nigeria in areas where there were already established structures of traditional system of leadership. So in Kenya, they used structured communities such as the Wanga and the Maasai, and in northern Nigeria, they used the emirs and caliphates to perpetuate their indirect rule. Number three, you can say that another similarity comes in that in areas where there were no established traditional rulers, such as most part of the Bantu, Highland Nilotes, Plain Nilotes, and the Kushites parts of Kenya, who never had structural rule, in such areas, direct rule was used. The same can be applied to southern Nigeria and Lagos, who had various communities with various cultures. So in such areas where there were no established traditional rule, they had to use direct rule. Again, you can talk about the similarity in terms of resentment of colonial rule. So both areas, there were challenges. In both countries, there were challenges that the British faced. So for instance, the resentment of Africans against taxation, the resentment of Africans against the forced labor employed on them by the chiefs, then the resentment of African elites against the uneducated or traditional chiefs. So it both happened in Nigeria and it both happened in Kenya. So class, that was our lesson for today. Thank you and have a nice time.